Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar titled The Roles of Power and Oppression in the Academic Community. My name is Chelsea Burchett, and I am a PhD student studying social and health psychology at Stony Brook University and the Diversity Officer for SPICY's Graduate Student Committee. My research focuses on the intersecting identities and experiences of women of color in academia and their chosen career pathways. You're muted.
And my name is Rebecca Hill. I'm a clinical psychology PsyD student at Nova Southeastern University in Fort Lauderdale, and I am on my pre-doc internship currently. I'm really interested in the ways that equity and diversity show up in clinical care, and it's an important part of how I navigate my work with my clients and personal and professional spaces. So I'm really excited to have you all join us today.
Our panelists today are Rebecca Covarrubias, Desdamona Rios, and Danielle Dickens. Dr. Covarrubias is an associate professor of psychology and faculty director of the Student Success Equity Research Center at the UC Santa Cruz. As a social and cultural psychologist, she examines how dominant institutional values and practices perpetuate educational inequity for low-income, first-generation students of color by privileging middle-class white ways of being. She then examines how to reverse these effects through culturally informed approaches that draw attention to students' cultural strengths. Committed to goals of social justice and social change, her research engages diverse collaborations, such as students, staff, practitioners, and programs, and methodologies to produce research findings grounded in problems of practice. Dr. Rios is an associate professor of psychology and director of the Latinx and Latino American Studies program at the University of Houston, Clear Lake. She has published on intersectionality in the academy, including pedagogical practices and faculty experiences. She has received 3 national teaching awards from the American Psychological Association's Society for the Teaching of Psychology, Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, and the Association for Women in Psychology. She is also the recipient of UHCL's Hayes Diversity Award for her work with underrepresented groups in academia. Dr. Dickens is an assistant professor of psychology at Spelman College. Dr. Dickens uses an interdisciplinary approach as an instructor, mentor, and researcher. That is social justice focused around issues of race, ethnicity, gender, age, and class in higher education and the workplace. She teaches courses such as psychology of women and psychology of racism, using an intersectionality and Black feminist pedagogical approach. In 2019, she was the recipient of the Mary Roth Walsh Teaching of Psychology of Women Award for her innovative class assignment on gender identity. She also does work in the community by facilitating workshops to help Black women negotiate their experiences in the workplace.
Our agenda today will include about 40 minutes of conversation with the panelists and the moderators. Then we'll do a live Q&A portion with the audience with some pre-submitted questions, or if you have any questions, please pop them into the chat. We will also ask the questions that were submitted in advance, so if you did any of those, thank you. As an opening, Chelsea and I just want to share some hopes for this webinar. The aim of this webinar is really to highlight the ways in which power and oppression are part of the academic communities and disrupt meaningful relationship building. This is true for many students and unfortunately most salient for members of already generally marginalized populations, such as Black, Indigenous, and other students of color. The goal of this webinar is to understand the dynamics at play and to identify the needs for the academic institutions, professors, and students to engage in meaningful learning and make meaningful affirming change. To begin with our first questions, and this is geared towards all of our panelists, so feel free to answer as your kind of thoughts come to you. The first question is, in what way do dominant values in educational settings further perpetuate inequity for students of color and students from low-income backgrounds? And so feel free to start us off with any of you.
Okay, I will start off. And just as an update, I would say that I, as of 2021, I'm an associate professor now. I recently tenured. Thank you. Thank you. But I just want to start off by that in saying that the systems, if we think about higher ed and academia, that oftentimes it includes these hidden rules or cultural norms that many people that belong to underrepresented groups and backgrounds are not privy to. And so once they then enter into these spaces, they have to navigate in ways of trying to figure out what are those hidden rules, norms, and expectations. And so it puts, we're already at a disadvantage. And so then it further perpetuates that disadvantage because of not being aware of the system of higher ed and how it works, even as a graduate student, when it comes to different processes. And then as you continue to matriculate into professorship, thinking about tenure and promotion. So I just want to start off by saying that.
I think that's so excellent. And actually, I was going to begin my answer with that as well. I think the competitive nature of academia, which is this very individualistic sort of pursuit of success. And I think that is really jarring for some of us, anxiety provoking. But I also think the way that we grade, the system of grading, as you mentioned, Danielle, we're all starting off at different points, depending on our academic background, what high schools we went to, et cetera, et cetera. And so the system that we've all inherited of grading is a big problem. And so I've been practicing with something called ungrading to think about how do we address, like we have this jargon of meeting students where they're at, but what does that actually look like in practice? And so I think the way that we, the assessments that we use are also, I think, perpetuate this inequality.
I think the only thing I'll add is that, we know from its inception that systems of higher education and US schooling in general have been normed for just different groups, right? It was for male, affluent, upper to middle class students and a really different purpose. And yet we have this large sort of demographic shift, right, across the nation. And now institutions are like trying to figure out what does it mean to serve students? And yet how do you do that when the structures within these institutions still reflect some of those past norms? And so a lot of our work is trying to, and a lot of, I think, the labor, especially of faculty of graduate students navigating the academy, is unpacking those structures, making them very visible. For us, it's visible, it's lived experience, but for folks who have gone in some ways, just not aware because of privilege, because of, because the system serves them, right? So trying to figure out how ways of unpacking that so that we better understand that anywhere down from grading to the policies that we have, right, the everyday lived experience. This is a cultural system, right? So you're going to see it in the messaging that we get, in the ways that we teach, right? If we can learn to really understand how to reframe all those things, I think then we can start to ask the question about, whether we can bring our full selves. But right now, right, the structures are so that certain groups are very privileged, welcome, can see themselves in seamless ways within those learning contexts. And that's just not true for everybody. But I think there's been a lot of amazing work among this group, I imagine all the folks in this participant panel, trying to unpack that in different ways. And I think the research and the scholarly perspectives, but also lived experiences, are really important to highlight because we can pinpoint what they are. I think, I love that Desi brought up the idea of grading as one example, right? But we can think about that in terms of, right, like how we even think about what good writing means in academia. Who is our audience for our research work? Who do we privilege in that work? And Danielle, I appreciate this idea that I think it's right. A lot of that stuff is hidden. We don't know how sometimes to access it. And then some of it is just blatant. And I think both of those are really hard, confusing, and toxic things. But that there's a lot of really good work on folks creating counter spaces where we can actually create a new vision for what it looks like. And I think that's what feels really exciting and I think important.
Thank you. Those are all really amazing comments and answers to that question. To follow up with that, I'm curious how, because at all levels of academia, from administration to donors and departmental and faculty and students, we see these disparities between what people are afforded and the privileges. So how can we take some of the burden off of those that are marginalized and share the burden to create an environment that better serves everyone and not just the privileged?
So I think in this way, we have to think both at the individual level, but also at the systemic level. At the individual level, of course, we can do things like educate ourselves, advocate for others, those sorts of things. But something that we don't talk a lot about is how we perpetuate the system unconsciously. But we all sort of learn to have the same expectations of certain groups. And so sometimes as students of color, we might have these expectations of faculty of color. And when boundaries are set, right, and we're always talking about that too, self-care. But when someone engages in that behavior, in my experience, my observations, there's kind of, lots of judgment about someone's availability, about who we can count on, right? And so I think it's also being mindful about our expectations of each other and honoring each other. Are we asking the same of each other as we might a white male colleague? Are we making those same demands? Are we judging him for taking the weekend off with his children? And so those sorts of things I see over and over again, the jargon, but actually the behavior not lining up with that. And then I have some ideas for the systemic level, but I won't. I'll give someone else some airtime.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you said, Desi. I think we have to disrupt the system. And on an individual level, as you mentioned, we have to be mindful of not perpetuating this cycle of, if people were trained in a particular way and hazed in a certain sense, not feeling that they have to do that same to other graduate students or even other faculty as they are progressing through their position, through their career. So just being mindful of that. And then also, I think we have to be just honest with ourselves and where we're at. I think oftentimes there is this perception idea that because people are in academia, that they are inclusive. And they may present themselves as such. And so I think it's important that people have to be honest and accepting of their own biases and where they are and ways in which they can improve as it relates to how they interact with their colleagues, think about professors, and also how they interact with their own students. And now I think there's so much, talk as it relates to just our article recently. And I know it's happening in a lot of states about ending tenure and promotion and just thinking about what that means, especially for those who are marginalized. So it's so many things that are happening. And I think that also goes to as well, who are we voting, right? And to serve as certain representatives, like that impacts us at the institutional at other levels, of course, when we think about different institutions. So it's this cycle and things that we have to really think about, being strategic about even who, like I said, who we are electing for within our state, that may impact our own positions at our institutions.
Yeah, and I echo that. I think it's a systems level approach when we think about how to redo a system that wasn't designed for us, right? And I think about a theory of culture change where that meaningful change can happen. Some folks think like burn it all down and start over. Some folks might think that we can work within it to change it. And I think we need multiple theories of change here to really think about what it means to shift the ways that we do things. One thing that has been very salient for me and that I think can have trickle down effects is just our personnel review process, like how we evaluate our work as faculty, because especially faculty of color, the buckets of research, teaching, and service, right? For many of us, those things are very much integrated, and we're expected to be excellent in all of them. And yet we know that research is sort of the golden standard by which we're evaluated. Though that kind of review process not only, creates stressors, especially for faculty of color, women faculty of color in particular. A lot of our invisible labor doesn't fit really nicely into some of these buckets, right? And yet we do a lot of work for the university that sustains a mission of serving students and of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'll just say that it also impacts the ways that we can teach, right? And the ways that we can mentor. So it also impacts the graduate students that we work with. So I would really love to reimagine that personnel review process so that it's more complex, so that it reflects better the multiple critical ways that we contribute strength to an institution like higher education. Because right now, and for many, many years, people have written about this, right? Those kinds of traditional buckets are not serving or capturing, I think, the diversity and rich ways that we exist as like humans, but also that kind of keep the institution kind of going. So, I mean, that's a really large structural change that requires a lot of resources to rethink. And yet this is the thing that we come into it and we kind of keep going, right? Like, I have to publish, and what kind of pressures does that set for folks coming after me, for example?
So I think those were some of the structural examples that I was going to give, and those are really, really important. So revising tenure and promotion, standards. Now, just because it's on paper doesn't mean it's going to be interpreted differently. So on top of that is instituting some type of professional development for everyone, that they're able to evaluate this work through a much broader lens instead of the very narrow lens that most of us, academia, we're inheriting most of the same tools. Some of us are lucky and, we got a little extra, but for the most part, people are inheriting the same tools. So some kind of, professional development that is instituted at our universities. Now I know budgets and all that kind of stuff. There's lots of arguments against that. But training search committees, that's something else, where I have been on a search committee with feminists who have ripped apart women of color, made up stories. Like, I think someone else did her analysis. So it's having people in the room who are trained to point those sorts of biased statements out. Other examples, well, this person seems really, really busy. I don't know if this would be a good to add this on, right? So it's also imagining for the greater good, on behalf of this person's well-being, we're not going to hire them because they are very different from us. I've been on committees for senior level administrators who the entire list was men. And so I was the only one in the room who saw that there were no women on this list of finalists. And then there was an argument that transitioning from a community college to a four-year university, that was the argument against some of the women, why we couldn't. So I asked, are these skills so unique that they don't translate? And they said, well, it's just there's different, right? So the question never got answered. And I kept asking, that's wonderful information, thank you, but that wasn't my question. And so that's uncomfortable. And so, we all need a lot of training to develop these skills on how to continue to ask those questions and not give up, because it does get uncomfortable after a while because people don't want to answer them.
Thank you so much, all of you, for your responses. I think you really highlighted how big the scope of this is, that it's not just about the individual person on faculty. It's really a big systemic shift that needs to happen. And like you highlighted with the changes and the training that needs to take place being such important pieces of that. And I think Dr. Covarrubias, you highlighted this a little bit, that it's about, first the system changing and then making space for the individual to kind of use their cultural strengths. And that actually was going to speak nicely to our next question, because, I know I'm wondering what that would even look like, right? What would it look like for students to be able to utilize their own cultural strengths in academic settings?
I mean, the thing I'll share is that we have, there's some beautiful work by women of color scholars. Like, I'm thinking of Yoso's work, but Rios Aguilar also has this framework on what does it mean to recognize community cultural wealth. And the idea is that every minority student has wealth, right? But that if institutions don't have the tools or resources to recognize it, it's virtually rendered insignificant. And it's a really, I think, missed opportunity for thinking about transforming our learning spaces. And so, I think the responsibility among institutions is to create learning interactions, environments, whatever they might be, that first help students recognize their own wealth. I mean, can you imagine going through all that years of schooling and interacting with stereotypes, with ways of not being seen, right? It's really just important to let people know that, like, you have wealth, like you have so many things that you've brought from your community that are important for learning and that we need for our learning. That as a first basis, I think, can provoke a lot of conversation and reflection, and I think self-love. And then after that, I think it's about carefully constructing our learning environments in ways that help students, I think, activate that. I mean, that's what they call, right, activation of their capital. And I think that can look as simple as like inviting, multiple languages, affirming students' own language use, or what is the thing that motivates students to go to their class in the first place, and how can we leverage that to connect to what they're learning in the classroom, for example. I mean, it's really tied to sort of what we're talking about, is like bringing that whole person, right, that is full of motivations, expectations, lived experience, and how do we tie that to the things that they're learning or a conversation that they're having in office hours, so that we're not treating them as sort of these, like, beings that don't have a collective, like, being behind them or community behind them or lived history. So, I mean, there's frameworks about how to do this, except that, I also just want to recognize as faculty, we also, again, have our own constraints, right? Like, we're trying to create that space for our students while also trying to navigate our own, like, pressures. And it's a hard thing. I think that's why it needs to be structural, because then you have this, like, grad students are in the same position where they're trying to support graduate students or undergrads and do their own work. And that's why counter spaces can't be the answer. That's why it needs to be sort of larger kind of structural change here. But yeah, I think you can start by just affirming that students have something really important to add to the learning space.
Yeah, those are great points. And just to add to that, I think it's important that in academia, students, faculty, that we bring ourselves to that space and to really center ourselves in our needs, and to recognize, what do we want to get out of this experience, right? The institution is thinking about what they can get out of the students and the faculty, but I think it's important to go into these spaces of, like, what are my goals? Like, what do I want to get from this space? Or what are my ultimate career goals? What type of experiences that I want to have, and really center on that. And then also, I think it's important to, in order to utilize one's strengths, I think it's important to also, for one, to know their own weaknesses so that you don't hear it from someone else. And I think about, my experience as a graduate student, being told early on that I basically wasn't a good writer. And I found it out through email from another graduate student, but it was said by a professor. And so, but I didn't internalize that. Right. And if I did, I don't know if I would have stayed in academia if I internalized those type of messaging. So I think it's really important to hone in on who you are, what do you want to get out of this space, and building community around that, and also establishing boundaries around that, right? Being mindful of where you spend your time, right? Even if I was very strategic about that, maybe my first year in graduate school, I attended traditional events. Like, there was a Halloween party that was something that all the graduate students went to. But after experiencing all discrimination, I was like, I'm not attending these events. Now, I know that there may be some costs associated with that in terms of not being in those certain spaces and not being privy to certain information. But I really wanted to focus on my well-being. And I said that I'm not going to attend those events. And so that made me feel more at peace. And that was a way that I, established boundaries and kind of utilized my cultural strengths of really spending my time and energy on things that were going to better myself and help me get to where I wanted to be. And I do that as well in my current position.
I want to follow up on that because I think that's so powerful, Danielle. I think the Academy can, as you mentioned, they're thinking about what they can get out of us, right? And it is very easy to get consumed with our work. And I think recognizing our individual needs, what we need, but also how you're contributing to the community, in a positive way. And that does involve setting those boundaries and knowing which spaces make me feel like I'm growing and which ones are sucking the life out of me. Yeah.
I feel like that was probably the perfect setup for my next question, just because you mentioned establishing these healthy boundaries and really centering yourself in spaces that make you feel like that nurture you in many ways. So for people who unfortunately often have to work twice as hard, how do we set those boundaries? How do we protect our time and our energy, our workload when we're trying to advance, but yet we, just feel like we have to work even harder to get to the same place that other people are getting to, that may be more privileged, and just generally, how do we unload that burden of having to maybe even also focus on the diversity related issues as well, and how that can be burdensome for people of color?
I'm going to take it outside of work. And this is not advice we often get because we're encouraged to network to build our careers, which is good advice. But I think we can start to undervalue our home communities, where we come from, what our families have taught us. And I think it's really important to check back in because they remind you of your humanity. They remind you that you do work too much, and that there's not a lot of people like us. We start to feel like that because we're surrounded by other PhDs and, everybody around us is really smart. But the rest of the world doesn't act as crazy as we do, with working 80 hours a week and being really competitive and being upset because I'm not doing enough, right? And so checking back in with people not in academia can ground you and remind you that there's a whole wide world out there and we are each doing our piece, right, to try to make it better, and that we don't have to kill ourselves for that.
I love that, Dizzy. It's so true. Like, I think I also say that, like, I remember when I was in grad school, I used to feel like so guilty for not working, and I would like not make a decision. Like I'd spend a Saturday, for example, not releasing that I wasn't going to work that day. So then I didn't work, but then I also felt bad for not working. And now it wasn't until like I was a postdoc in faculty that I was able to unlearn some of that. And it's a hard thing because I think Desi's right. We're very unique, right? I mean, this is like a very high achieving group that probably has some behaviors around perfectionism. And because we've been rewarded so long in kind of schooling, that we've learned those things, and it's really, really hard to unlearn, especially when the culture itself still continues to reward some of those things. I think family and community are really great places. I also think if you can find spaces even within academia where people can like affirm that as well is really important. So like having a friend like Desi, for example, because we can just talk about different things, that it doesn't just have to be our work selves, but just like our personal lives, for example, or connections with students, where we can be a little bit more open and vulnerable and talk about what self-care has to look like so we can release some of that guilt. So I think it's right. Community connections, however you define community, is super important, and finding the things that you love and trying to release some of the guilt and pressure. Like just do it. Life is so short. I know that sounds a little, but it's like, yeah, we're not just defined by our work. And it's hard because I know many of us are committed to it for different reasons. And I love what I do. And at the same time, like boundaries are super important so that I can continue doing it. Otherwise, I'll be honest, like I burnt out really fast, I think, in my job, because I came in with such a big open heart to do all this work. And then you realize that like people will take and take and take. So you have to learn to set the boundary. And that's so hard. I'll say that that was especially hard for me as like a woman of color, given how I was like raised, and like, so a lot of it is also my unlearning personally about like cultural norms around what those identities mean.
And trust me, the work will be there on Monday. I promise.
It will.
It will be there. Take
Mhm.
some time off, enjoy yourself. Mhm.
Right. Yeah. And just establishing different boundaries in terms of I'm not going to work after a certain time, or I'm going to have these days where I'm not going to do anything that's work related. And then also things I've learned too is not to take things personally in terms of, like, I think about when I experienced in my program, I was the only phenotypically Black woman in the psychology department. And I, over time, I realized that when people were discriminatory against me, that they had certain perceptions about Black people, Black women before they interacted with me. And they were just putting their stuff on me. And so I learned not to take those things personally. Like, I'm not going to take on their stuff, right? Whatever they're dealing with in terms of their own biases, I'm not going to take that on. And so that was something that I had to be really intentional about. That's their stuff, and I'm not going to accept that and internalize that. And I think, as you all mentioned, it's so important to change, our mindset of having that feel pressure to work all the time. And then to develop your own timeline of what are your goals that you want to accomplish, and kind of work from that. I think there's always this certain idea of, publish or perish, or you have to, get a certain amount of publications, you have to do a certain amount of conferences, et cetera. But you have to go at your own pace. And I always say, to me, wherever you're supposed to be, you'll be, right? Coming out of graduate school, I had a few publications, but I didn't have a lot of what people would consider to be the amount of publications you should have. And I ended up being in my dream job of going back and being a professor at Spelman. So I think you have to really develop and work at your own timeline. What are your goals? And to try to block out the noise. And I know it's easier said than done, but of that competitive culture, as you were mentioned earlier, Desi, to really figure out what's your own timeline, your own goals, and kind of work from that. And also, I just want to add too, it's so important to work out and to eat healthy, clean eating. And not that you have to be so hard on yourself, but I realized once I started working out when I was in my graduate program, I just felt so more at ease. And so really adding, carving out time, putting that on my schedule, that this is the time I'm going to, whether it be pray, meditate, work out, trying to cook more than I eat out. Those are some things too that I did that was intentional to maintain my well-being.
Agree. Exercise is so important for our bodies, eating well, but I also recommend a donut from time to time because they are delicious and make me happy.
It's a great recommendation. Thank you all so much for all those answers. I know for me as an early career, and I would imagine for a lot of other attendees, it's just so good to hear the ways in which you've all sought to protect your humanity, sought to protect your peace in spaces where it's so hard to do that. And my next question I'm pulling actually from the chat. So thank you to everyone who's been submitting. There's so many great questions to choose from. The first thing I kind of want to ask, and it was asked by Asia, I'm going to reword a little bit, but I'm wondering how you all, as leaders in your academic communities, as people who are now operating with more power, what kind of lessons you've learned about how to use that power to better kind of support your students or navigate spaces, especially in environments where white supremacy is so dominant, what that's been like for each of you and what you're willing to share.
I'll give a shout out to my grad student, Kat Quintero. She led this project actually that addresses this exact question, but she was looking at how faculty of color engage in everyday resistance. And these are things that you might not think are resistance, but they're everyday things that actually push back on the institution. And some of the things that we interviewed 15 faculty of color around their leadership experiences, and self-care came out as number one, but like doing things that like are your hobbies, saying no to things. And I see your question here around like, yeah, the onus on the person And I think going back to our earlier conversation around this is a systems level approach, right? That we need the structural change, but we also know that change is slow. So until then, like we do need some, I think, these resistance strategies that kind of shape the culture, not only for ourselves, but also for the folks that we mentor, for our colleagues. Like if we model a different way, I think we can start to shift a little bit of mindsets around this. Some of it was also like walking away from things and not feeling any guilt around that. Also not being, I think, Danielle, you mentioned this earlier, not being the same gatekeepers to knowledge, to resources, to opportunities in the ways that we may have experienced. So I think these are all important parts of our leadership as faculty, or even as graduate students, depending on whatever position we have, even if we might be limited in the amount of change that we can make. These everyday kinds of things that kind of shift the culture in terms of the daily interactions, I think matter for larger culture change. And I agree with your question here, is that there has to be institutional level, and that means larger structural change, pushing back on administrators, right? More coalition building around some of these things, even as our discipline in psychology, right? Like there's more spaces now talking around anti-racist methods, the way that we think about our peer review process, for example, and editing. All these things matter, and they have to work in tandem. It's not one thing's going to solve everything, because culture change is hard. But I will just say that I think for me, the lesson that I'm sitting with right now is the self-care, and yet it's so hard to do because we're so used to giving and doing, that just learning to be is really hard, I think. And having accountability has helped me to maybe embrace that a little bit more. And that comes from students, colleagues, friends, outside and inside the academy, therapy. It's just so many things. I think that it takes a collective to just unlearn a lot of that and learn what it means to self-care, because we're just so used to, I think, being on this like production wheel, I think.
Therapy, absolutely, unfortunately for most of us. I have a couple of examples. So if you are interested, strategically volunteer for leadership committees on your campus, faculty senate, those types of things. Volunteer to chair a hiring committee. Those are some of the things that I have taken on recently. Leading university-wide diversity initiatives where there's lots of well-intentioned people who are not trained, and they think if you're just really, really nice to people of color, that'll solve everything, right? So taking on those leadership positions where you can share, as you said, Becca, share your knowledge, give it away. Ask those powerful questions. Well, what if we hired someone who was so different than us? What are some of the good things that could happen, right? So ask those questions that make people uncomfortable. If you are tenured, right? Well, so far, hope, things are in question, but, you can do those things. Another way to use your privilege is the way that you teach in the classroom. So I mentioned earlier this practice of ungrading. I can do that as a tenured professor, and sort of play around with what happens when we start to assess students differently. So I just had final ungrading meetings with my students. They present a portfolio of their work over the semester. They do a thematic analysis of my feedback on all their writing, and then they talk about how they've grown. One student, when she started, so Danielle made me think of your story about being told you're a bad writer, but reframing it, right? These are some good ideas. Here are some things to work on. Have you visited the Writing Center? So at her last meeting, she told me that she had never read a journal article, nor had she ever been asked to cite research to support her writing. So in any other class, she probably would have failed. But by the end of our class, she did see work. It was satisfactory. She was starting to cite her work. And I think in those ways, those are really powerful ways to help students see their potential, but now that's all hers. Anytime she ever feels like this is really hard, I can't do it, she now has this class as an experience. Yeah, you know what, I can do it. I might have to ask other people for help, but I can do it eventually. In traditional grading, by the midpoint, I'm getting less than 50% on whatever, right? I'm not going to pass the class. And so those are just a couple of examples where you can really shake things up.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I really think authenticity is a form of resistance, and really using your voice. So I think about as a graduate student, I knew um, the the things that I was up against, and so I use my voice in a sense of when a professor or another graduate student said something that was completely out of line, I would go to the department chair and share with them my experience, especially, like I said, being the only phenotypically Black woman, Black person in the department. So I would, and so even in classes, when we had to give examples, I would share my experiences because I was like, okay, I'm probably the only one that may be experiencing this in this space. So everyone's gonna know that this is what I've been experiencing. I didn't do it every time, and whenever I felt led to do it. And I think now, even as a faculty member, it's so important that I think any institution that you're at, you're going to have, faculty that have been there for a long time, that have a certain ways of thinking. And so I realized too that I have to use my voice, even if it's different from everyone else's, right? We sometimes get into this idea of groupthink, or because of the institution that you're at, that you may go against people that are well respected in your field or at your institution, but you have to still speak true. And even if that means going against the grain, I think it's important to do that. And I recognize that I can do that now as a tenured professor, which maybe I didn't feel as comfortable before, but recognizing your strengths, as we mentioned before, and then really just using your voice. I think our voice is so powerful, and know that's so simple, but just utilizing our voice and being strategic in that, knowing who to go to for certain things, recognizing who you can trust and who you can't trust. And those are ways in which you can, I think, navigate some of those politics while still having a voice.
Danielle, that's also a great point, because my one piece of advice, if I can only give one, is look for behavior. Do not be seduced by the jargon. Lots of people have the diversity jargon down and they say lots of beautiful things, and we want to believe we can trust everyone, right? But look for the behaviors. Look for the people who are standing up, who are putting themselves in uncomfortable positions as a good ally. So make sure that those behaviors align with that beautiful, beautiful jargon.
Oh gosh, thank you so much. That was really informative. And I think that speaks, talking about using your voice and about allies speaks to Bonnie's question that I'll read from the chat, and then also one of our pre-submitted questions that I'm going to try to marry the two. But Bonnie asked, and she said, I'm curious about the panelists' experiences of challenging the system from within. So in particular, what have been some of the personal and professional consequences of doing that work? And how have you managed those consequences in terms of defending your own mental and physical health and your well-being? And then to dovetail off of that, how can white graduate students or faculty or colleagues support BIPOC colleagues in the face of such power imbalance and discrimination?
That was a lot, and I feel like we're all really polite and waiting for the others. Can you say that again, please? Maybe start with one, and then we can move on to the other.
Absolutely, yeah, no problem. So Bonnie's question is, I'm curious about the panelists' experiences of challenging the system from within. In particular, what have been the personal and professional consequences of that work? And how have you managed those consequences?
I think for me, it's like just burnout. I think, I'm at an institution where my department is actually really supportive and recognizes actually the value of social justice work. I think though the university functions, there's different levels, right, that you're navigating. There's a department level, then their divisional level, then their university level, and even outside that university. And the experience is very dramatically depending on where you are, obviously, even within an institution. But for me, right, the idea that first, I'm from a first generation background, that I'm first time being faculty. It's just also like the time it takes to learn and observe and figure out like, what is it, even the expectations for me as faculty, while also supporting my entire research team and trying to navigate the structures of tenure and promotion. And now, mid-career life, like doing all of that while also trying to figure out what's the vision that I want to have for my students in their learning spaces on top of the teaching and service, right? It's a lot to do, and just learning what the rules of the game are as faculty, for example, because a lot of them are implicit, and you do have to figure out like, who can you trust, right? Who are the folks with most power, even though we want to believe that these things are sort of non-hierarchical, but they are. I mean, they're necessarily hierarchical. And so I think for me, the biggest consequence has been burnout, actually, just like saying yes to the things that I felt were really important for that work, but also recognizing that I can't be 100 places at once, even though that's where I was sort of setting myself up as. And it's having to learn like, and really question like, what are the major things that I want to dedicate my time to, because it's so precious, it's so limited, and where do I want to make the most change, and recognizing that like that those come in waves. Like I don't have to do everything at once, but that like maybe this is where I'm focusing right now, and as I develop more leadership skills and tools and self-care, that I can shift my focus later. Instead of, I think my problem was that I said yes to everything, and then by year 6 I was like so spent, like, and that is just I think it's a really big consequence, and I wish I would have figured out a better way of navigating that, but it's a hard thing, because that, I mean, that's part of like the implicit parts of it too, like nobody tells you that, and it's really easy to tell faculty just to say no, but like that's not, when it's the work that sustains us, it's also about figuring out what is the things I should say no to, and the things that you can't say no to. I mean, that's part of that game too. So for me, the biggest consequence has been burnout, for sure.
We don't have a lot of good role models who behaviorally show us this is what it looks.
Yeah, and I just have to say, I guess I was take a different approach to that question, but for instance, I think about, I was recently, can't share all the details, but I was in a faculty meeting, and I didn't agree with what others were sharing, and but I used my voice, as I mentioned, and especially I recognize too that I attended Spelman for undergrad, was at 2 predominantly white institutions, and then now a faculty member at Spelman. And so being in these different spaces, you have to also recognize your own perspective and what you come with. And so it probably upset some people, some things that I said in the meeting. But one thing that I realized that was so important, I tried to do, is that being mindful of burnout, as Rebecca mentioned, even though that's difficult to do, but also I try to approach it in a way of I let my work speak for itself. And so I know that me being able to voice my opinion, even though it was different from everyone else's in that meeting, I also know that I have brought a lot of money to my institution and all the work that I've done, whereas only so much that other people can do, right? Because they recognize that I am an asset to, and just like others, an asset to the institution. So I think it's also important to try to do as much as you can as well, so that that it shows that you're an asset to that institution, right? So whether it may be, you may voice your concern, it may be go against the grain, but what could really happen? What's the consequence when they know that you're an asset to that institution? So that's something I wanted to add to that conversation.
So I'm going to go a little bit darker, because it sounds like Covarrubias and Dickens have had some reasonable colleagues in their department. Not all departments are like that. You can be an asset, you can be getting national teaching awards, and bullying is a big problem in academia. And I've watched other colleagues have been bullied out of their institutions, out of their roles. People get jealous. And especially if you are consistently questioning the practices? How is this best for students? How is this best for our professional development? How is this best for developing a culture of excellence? If you're consistently questioning the status quo, and especially if it has to do with issues of race and gender and diversity, that makes people very uncomfortable. And so I also want to say that this work takes a long time, because I'm wrapping up my 10th year and things in my department are now starting to shift. We have a new chair, lots of good things are happening, but that took years and years of advocating. And if you are not careful, you do burn out. But I also started to somaticize these things, chronic back issues. And so that is dangerous to ourselves, right, as individuals. And so looking for, who are your people, so to speak, who is your support system, checking in, because you can also start to feel kind of crazy, especially if you're doing work that no one else in the department is doing, that no one else seems to value. So find your people who can support you, who can assure you you are not crazy. But this is also an issue. So, bullying is a big problem. I think we're starting to address that in academia, but we don't talk about it enough.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. I'm going to lead us into our last question before we really wrap up for the day. And I was wondering if you could all speak to how all of us as members of the academic community can more consciously make space for people of diverse backgrounds, and also balance that with not tokenizing any one person for doing all the work of an institution. And I know you've all touched on that kind of in different answers, but maybe speaking to that to kind of wrap us up today would be helpful.
I would say, I think it's important to, I know we previously mentioned this, I think Rebecca, you mentioned this, but I think it's important to create more counter spaces and without questioning those counter spaces. Because I remember being in, at predominantly white institutions and being questioned, like, why do we have this Black group? Right. So I think unapologetically creating these counter spaces is really important. And also be put in a plug, I think it's important to think about ways in which these institutions can partner with other institutions that are getting it right, like historically Black colleges and other minority serving institutions, whether it be, facilitating more collaborations and partnerships with faculty, with students. But I think it's so key, I think about those counter spaces and even mentorship programs that are geared towards people that belong to marginalized groups and even multiple marginalized groups. I think those are ways to make that space, because I think it's important when you are in those predominantly white spaces where, I think about, for me, that being in a space, I see a lot of other Black women constantly. But when I was in predominantly white spaces, I needed those moments of escape. Even if it was just for 30 minutes, I needed that. So it's so important to create those spaces that just belong to, whether it be other women of color, Black women, so that they have those escape spaces where they can really truly be their authentic selves without question, without apology.
I think, yeah, it's such a complex, I mean, all these questions are really complex. There's the short answer is there's so much work that we need to do. But I think that, I mean, this is why I like to think about it as like a structure of systems and policies, right? Because it in some cases, like those, we can, even as people of color, we can perpetuate those things because we may have internalized some of those structures as well. So I think one place like to start to is just deep reflection on our own positionalities. Like, where do we sit in places of marginalization, but also of privilege? Like, I have to think very thoughtfully about being faculty now, right? And how that separates me a little bit from my students, but also what responsibility do I have as faculty not to perpetuate some of those things? So I think part of that transformation is inner work. And then also the connecting work of creating those spaces. I absolutely agree with Danielle that those spaces are essential. And I hope that we can get to a place where we don't need counter spaces anymore, that the learning setting is like our space where everything feels sort of validated and affirmed. Not that we all agree, that's not what I'm saying, but just that, you know, our ways of thinking and knowledge can be respected in that space and acknowledged, honored, right? And I just think that counter spaces do a really good job at this, and we just have so much to learn from them. But I think the last thing that I'll say is that creating, in those counter spaces, more spaces where we can just be more human, more compassionate, more caring, bring the parts of ourselves that are like, remind ourselves why we even do the work and why we're brought to do this work and how much we love it, like talking about the joy in the work and creating spaces to talk about that joy and not just the challenges is really important. Celebrating, I think, ourselves, like I think, just creating a more humanistic space, because I think it's true that we can't be ourselves everywhere and you have to be strategic, and that's sad. But until then, I hope that there's spaces that you can create where you can do that, because it's so sustaining and it's so loving. And those are the things that energize me the most. And they're important to have, I think, as you're navigating some of this.
So like your research, Becca, where you're looking for those specific behaviors, that's what I'm looking for. So one of the things I see is folks like Danielle will speak up, right? And then behind closed doors, people will come and be like, I'm so glad you said that in the meeting, right? Support your colleagues in public, right? Because that prevents us from looking like the angry Latina, the angry Black woman, right? The troublemaker. If other people are publicly supporting each other, then that starts to tell others that, okay, maybe this is, you know, not just this, you know, one crazy dissenter. And then the other thing is, again, leadership positions, you know, write policy, rewrite those policies at your university that could be discriminatory. So those are my two things.
Thank you all so much. That will be the ending comments for our webinar today, the roles of power and oppression in the academic community. Thank you so much to all our speakers for your time and your investment and your preparation and providing all your insight on this topic. So I really appreciate it. I know all of our attendees really appreciate it. And thank you to all the people who attended today. We're grateful to have you in this space with us. There's still more to examine in regards to how power and oppression shape our lives and how our relationships with institutions and communities and each other are shaped by it. So we still have a lot of work to do, but I really appreciate all your insight today.
Yes, and I'd like to echo what Rebecca has said. We also hope that you join us for our next webinar by our graduate student community. It's taking place on June 3rd at 2:30 p.m. Central Time. It's titled A Review of Immigration Policy Reform from Applied and Empirical Perspectives.
Lastly, I'll drop some key resources and contact info for the panelists in the chat that they've provided. So if you'd like to see more, hear more, or reach out to them, that'll be available to you in the chat. And thank you to the panelists for providing that and for kind of guiding some of our attendees to the next steps and to what we can continue to learn and work on as a community. So that'll be all. Thank you to everyone.